So Denise Daniels is going to be speaking next, the Hudson T. Harrison Professor of Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. And we welcome you. Thank you for being here, Denise.
Thanks, Craig. Can you all hear me? Okay, perfect. And Kyle, thank you so much for that book shout out. I did not expect that, but that that was nice. Um, so I'm gonna share my screen here real quick because I am gonna be going through a PowerPoint. Um, can you see that appropriately at this point?
Yep,
Good.
that's great.
Um, so I am going to be talking about how I teach at Wheaton College, and I come to the topic of entrepreneurship and in an entrepreneurship class, how I frame it from a theological perspective. Now, this is going to not work for everyone. This is not going to work in a secular context. It's probably not going to work from a non-Christian context, but I would encourage those of you who are not in explicitly Christian educational settings to kind of think about, are there ways that I could incorporate similar concepts in my particular location. So let me just start by talking a minute about my context, which is Wheaton College. It is a very explicitly Christian school. It is a liberal arts school, so we do not have a business school per se. I teach in the context of a business and economics department. And our students are required to take any number of classes that are not business and economics, even if they are business economics majors. It's quite small. We only have about 2,200 undergrads. And so the numbers of students that we're dealing with are small. I see the same students over and over. And there is a strong expectation for faith integration in all of our classes. So regardless of what you're teaching, there is an expectation that you will be bringing something to the table that is related to the Christian faith. And so when I'm thinking about entrepreneurship, I have two goals for my students when I'm kind of walking into a classroom and at the beginning of a semester teaching a general entrepreneurship course. I have two things that I'm thinking about for my students. One is I want them to think through their own faith-based framework for how they're going to approach this particular topic. So I want them to be thoughtful theologians themselves. And then secondly, I want them to cultivate a really thoughtful and accessible language to communicate their beliefs to others who are outside of their particular religious identity. So I want them to think Christianly, but I also want them to be able to talk to people who are not Christians. And I want them to be able to do that in a winsome way. I really appreciated David Miller's conversation earlier today, where I think he is doing some really similar things in a secular context, but trying in some ways to have some pretty similar goals. So what I do with my students is when I start talking about what does this mean to be theologians in the context of entrepreneurship, I give them a framework that's very Christian and very explicitly Christian. It's the creation, fall, redemption framework. This is something that lots of different theologians have written about over the years. It tends to be a little bit more of a reformed framework. You could do it different ways, but the idea is I want to give them kind of a whole sweep of the story of Scripture, and I want them to bring that to the table when they're thinking about business and entrepreneurship. And so I say the cliff notes for this are creation. Essentially, work is good, is what I'm trying to communicate. The second stage of this movement is fall, where sin enters the world and work becomes toilsome. And then the third stage is redemption. And I, again, really appreciated Philip and Hannah's conversation earlier when they were talking quite a bit about redemptive entrepreneurship with their Canvas model. But what does it mean in the workplace to engage in redemptive work, and how do we work with God to redeem work? And so that's the intro and the framework that I start with. And then I just ask them, I say, okay, think what comes to mind when you think about creation? And I usually will write up on the board, or if I've got a flip chart or whatever I have, I'll write down what they tell me. And so maybe you can do this yourself, kind of what comes to mind when you think about creation. And I get things like, well, God created. And so I'll write that down. God created. They say things like beauty or imagination or creativity, innovation, perfection, purpose, order, all sorts of things come up when I just say, give me what comes to mind when you think about creation. And then I do the same thing with Garden of Eden. Again, what comes to mind? What images does this provide for you? And they'll talk about things like relationships and goodness and perfection and beauty again, and freedom and life and ecosystems and abundance and nature and harmony, all these good words. And so I list all of these up on the board as well. And then I say, okay, well, is there a connection between what we've just talked about, what all these concepts that you came up with, their connection with those concepts and work? And what I'm trying to get them to think towards is the idea that God is a worker, that God created, and in that process, God demonstrated the fact that God was a worker. And so we move quickly into this notion that God models work at creation. And I have them, if they have their Bibles with them or on their phones, which they all have it on their phones, I have them pull it out and I say, let's look at Genesis. We're going to spend some time in Scripture, and we're going to talk about what Genesis suggests about work and ultimately about entrepreneurship. So we look at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the idea that God created and God is a worker. Now, years ago, I was trying this out on one of my kids, and I was saying something about God as a worker because God created. And this kid, who at the time was 6 years old, she looks at me and she goes, "Mom, that is not true. God just talked. He didn't really work." And and I had to laugh because, of course, as a professor, all I do is talk. And but we did get through that. Actually, God did work. And if you look at scriptures later in the second chapter of Genesis, it says by the seventh day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. So it really does convey this idea that God is working in the creation. And this is really important because a lot of the students come to class with the idea that work is something that we have to do because of the fall. And so they come with this kind of post-fall perception that work is toilsome, which it is, there's some truth in that, but they don't have this understanding that work initially, the way it was designed in the creation, was designed to be good, and that in fact God models it for us in the beginning. So what I'm trying to get them to get to is this idea that work is not a curse. Work, in fact, is quite good. And so then we also look at some other aspects of Genesis. What else do we see? And so one of the things that we see is that we as people are created in God's image. What does that suggest? Well, it suggests, among other things, that maybe we are designed to work, and that work itself might have meaning. The process of doing work has some meaning that's imbued by God because God himself is a worker. Years ago, I have a brother who has 12 children, and years ago his family lived in France, and my family went to visit them. And if anyone has 12 children, you can only imagine the amount of work that has to be done to, have that family be functional. And his kids were always assigned different tasks and doing different things. And when we came back from that trip, my oldest son, who at the time I think was like 7 or 8, he said to me, "Mom, I think we should work just like Uncle Dan's kids work." And I was like, "Yeah, that's a great idea. You guys totally should do that." And what was interesting to me was that he captured my son was experiencing the positive impact of this notion of work. And I was like, "Wow, we have not done this right." So I went to my sister-in-law and I said, "What did you guys do to make your kids like really love to work?" And she goes, "Actually, we just talk about it as something that God designed and God gave us. And we talk about it a lot as something that is a part of creation, and that's how we're made. And so when we do it, we actually reflect God's goodness." And so I was like, "Oh, I should do that." So I started trying to cultivate that with my own kids, maybe much less successfully than my brother and sister-in-law did, but nonetheless, trying to tap into tap into this idea that we are created in God's image and designed to work. Um, the next concepts that we see in scripture are that we are assigned work. Adam and Eve are assigned work, and they are assigned two different kinds of work specifically. They are assigned responsibilities to co-create with God. And so God tells them to be fruitful, to fill the earth, and to subdue it. And then God gives the instruction to Adam to name the animals. And then the second type of work that they are given is that they are told to maintain or care for God's creation. So we have these two responsibilities. We have these responsibilities to co-create with God, and we have the responsibilities to care for God's creation. And we can see that in Genesis as well. And then we get to the idea that God gives both freedom and boundaries around that freedom. So God tells Adam and Eve, "You are free." It tells Adam, but presumably gets communicated to Eve. "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat of it, you will surely die." So freedom, eat from anything, but there are boundaries around that freedom. And so that's an idea that we come back to as well a little bit later. And then we see at the creation, we see this idea that Adam and Eve are designed to be in relationship and in community with each other. We see that at the very beginning of creation when God says, "Let us make man in our image." And as a Christian, I come to this with an understanding of the Trinity that's built in. But this notion of relational, that God is in relationship with the Godhead, and that we should be in relationship with God, but we are also designed to be in relationship with each other, where God ultimately provides for Adam a helpmeet that can can be a partner with him in creation. So relationship is important. And then lastly, the last thing that I talk about from creation is the idea that God creates Sabbath. And so not only does God create, but God also rests from the creation. And so ultimately, I give them, we've talked through this, and we come to the summary. So we're created in God's image. God created work to be good. God gave us the privilege of co-creating. We're responsible for caring for creation and so on. And I tell the students now, let's try to translate these concepts because this is very Christian and very explicitly Christian, which is fine. This is good. But you're not going to be operating in a Christian context probably most of your lives. And so how would you think about translating some of these concepts? And I give them this particular assignment, and they have a piece of paper that says just this: we've discussed these characteristics of human beings and work that are the result of God's intent for us at creation. Take some time to translate these concepts into secular language. In other words, avoid any direct reference to either God or to creation. And so students get in groups and they spend some time going through this activity, and they come up with a list of concepts, things like, okay, humans are created in God's image. How could you say that without saying anything about God? And they say things like, well, humans are inherently valuable, or humans have dignity, or we should be respectful of people because they are inherently dignified or valuable. God created work to be good, but work is meant to be meaningful and fulfilling. So those are the ideas that they come up with in this process of translation. And it's kind of fun to go through it and have them think through, how could I talk about this in a way that would be not generic, but in a way that would be understood by people who maybe don't share my faith commitments, but people who could buy into the underlying concepts here. And it's actually a pretty fun exercise, I think, for them to go through. Then we go through, and I'm not going to do my whole lecture because we only have 15 minutes here, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview. We talk about the idea of fall and sin entering the world, where Adam and Eve disobey God. They take some of the fruit and they eat it. And then the implications of that are pretty significant, obviously, for Adam and Eve, but also for this notion of work that we've been developing through creation. And so I summarize, and we actually go through a lot more detail than this, but the summary of the fall section is that the image of God in humans becomes marred. It's not a perfect reflection anymore. We end up with damaged relationships with each other and with God. We end up personally enslaved, sometimes to our own addictions, sometimes to work itself, sometimes to laziness. But we have addictions that come into play. Work becomes toilsome, and we see that as part of the curse that gets communicated at the fall. And then people bring that baggage to work. So things that happen outside of work impact the ways that people engage at work. So we talk about the fall, and then we move into the third component, which is redemption. And this is the idea from a Christian perspective, again, that God acts to bring creation back into relationship with God through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we talk about what that means in terms of overcoming death and restoring relationships, but also in terms of balancing work and rest, and then ultimately in terms of redeeming work. And we talk about three ways that people can engage in redemptive work. They can do work that furthers what was intended at creation. They can do work that pushes back against the impacts of the fall. And so anything that's focused on justice, anything that's focused on restoring relationships would be an example of redemptive work because it's mitigating the effects of the fall. And then anything that transforms toil. And then ultimately we end with, what are the implications then for entrepreneurs? What are some things that we should be thinking about as we're thinking about creating a business? What are the implications for us? And so the implications specifically are in terms of what are the goods and services that you're thinking about providing? Are those redemptive? Are those aligned with God's purposes? We talk about the entrepreneur, him or herself, and as a leader, what does it mean to be a redemptive leader? And we talk about what it means to be a redemptive organization, and what structures of organizations might be more or less redemptive for the people who work in them. And so that's where we end. But it takes longer than 15 minutes, and I'm happy to share more content with anybody who is interested. If you're would want to reach out to me by email, I'm happy to share slides as well.
Denise, this is so wonderful. Thank you. Would you have time for a question or two?
Sure.
Maybe just one. Um,
I know we're pushing into
so
break. That's the problem.
yeah, no. A question came in about student experience. Even in the context of Wheaton College,
Mhm.
when you provide this theological anthropology of like humans do work, God does work, this is okay, and here's a process of creation, fall, and redemption. How does it impact the students, right? Like, do you get pushback? Is this new for the students?
I think, you know, at Wheaton College, all of our students come to campus with a profession of faith. So we have a pretty, in some ways, a homogenous group of students, quite different from other contexts where I have taught. Nonetheless, I think a lot of them are actually quite surprised to find that there's something about work in scripture or something about entrepreneurship or implications for entrepreneurship from scripture. But I think they also really enjoy it. I think there's something about it. There's a sense of, oh, this makes sense to me. And it allows them to engage their own faith in a way that I think is particularly meaningful beyond just kind of Sunday school answers of, I believe in Jesus, which again, all of our students would affirm. But that doesn't give them enough to provide information about what does that mean for how I'm going to engage in the workplace.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thanks also for the provision of your email for folks to follow up. Um, so friends and colleagues, we are at the halfway point of the Life Faith and Entrepreneurship Teaching Conference. I hope that you will stick with us. We are going to take a break. We are occurring across many time zones, so we will reconvene at what for me is 12 in Eastern Time. But please do take a break, meet your needs, and come back for more instruction on teaching faith and entrepreneurship. Thanks so much.